The albino foal whinnied desperately on the road. Edward sped up his SUV, trying to ignore it. He had a meeting with investors. But when the animal blocked his path 3 times, something in the valley below made his heart pound. What he discovered following that Mustang changed everything forever. Before we begin this story of redemption, tell me where you're watching from, and hit like if you believe that sometimes animals lead us exactly where we need to be. Ready? Then let's go. Edward Miller adjusted his platinum watch and dismissed his driver with a curt gesture. At 57, the agribusiness mogul didn't waste time with unnecessary pleasantries. His $200 million fortune had been built on a simple philosophy. Emotions were luxuries businessmen couldn't afford. The morning before, he had fired 50 employees by email. There was no meeting, no explanations, just numbers on a spreadsheet and a cold memo. Operational restructuring effective immediately. When his assistant mentioned that some had worked for the company for over a decade, Edward didn't even look up from his screen. Length of service doesn't pay dividends, was his only reply. Now driving alone through the vast expanses of his ranch properties, he felt the familiar satisfaction of absolute control. 12 ranches, nearly 100 acres, herds worth more than small towns. Everything meticulously calculated, every penny accounted for. There was no room for chance in his empire. His cell phone vibrated. His sister again. Third rejected call of the week, probably wanting to talk about family dates, memorial anniversaries, those things sentimental people insisted on celebrating. Edward had learned long ago that looking back only brought pain. Better to keep his eyes on the future, on the next contracts, the next acquisitions. The SUV rumbled down the dirt road when something white caught his eye ahead. An animal. Edward slowed down, frowning. It was a foal, no bigger than a large dog, with completely albino fur, rare even among the wild herds of the region. The animal was standing in the middle of the road, completely blocking his passage. Edward honked. The foal didn't move. He honked again, longer this time. Nothing. The animal remained there, its pink eyes fixed on the windshield as if it were waiting for something. Darn animal. Edward shifted into reverse, turned around, and took a secondary trail that bypassed the area. He had a video conference with Japanese investors in 2 hours. He couldn't be late because of a lost wild animal. But 500 yards later, there was the foal again. This time whinnying, a sharp, desperate sound that pierced the morning air. How on earth had it gotten there so fast? Edward felt a growing irritation rising in his chest. He honked 3 times in a row, accelerating slightly towards the animal. The foal moved away just enough not to be hit, but remained in the middle of the road. When Edward tried to pass on the side, the animal moved to block him again. It was as if it were trying to guide him somewhere. Edward stopped the SUV and looked out the window. The foal had positioned itself a few yards ahead, looking directly at him, then turning its head towards the valley that opened to the left. A valley Edward knew too well, a valley he had avoided for years. His heart pounded for no apparent reason. His hands gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. From that spot, he could see the mountains in the background, the skyline he used to draw as a child. When he still believed in things like kindness, family, second chances. The foal whinnied again, more urgently this time, and began to trot towards the valley. Edward remained still for long seconds, engine running, hands trembling imperceptibly on the steering wheel. The foal had stopped about 20 yards away, looking back as if expecting him to follow. It was absurd. He didn't follow wild animals. He had appointments, responsibilities, an empire to manage. But something about the urgency of those whinnies deeply bothered him. It wasn't normal. Foals didn't behave like this, didn't block roads, didn't seem to be asking for help. Against all rational instinct, Edward shifted into first gear and began to follow the animal at a reduced speed. The foal trotted ahead, stopping occasionally to make sure it was being followed, before continuing deep into the valley on trails Edward hadn't traveled in over a decade. The landscape began to change. Sparser trees, rockier soil, the kind of terrain that made his managers avoid that region during routine inspections. It was wild, unproductive area with no apparent commercial value. Edward had always known that wild horses inhabited there, but he had never bothered to investigate. Wild animals were the responsibility of the Fish and Wildlife Service, not his. The foal stopped abruptly and whinnied loudly, pointing its head down from a rocky elevation. Edward got out of the SUV and walked to the edge. What he saw made his stomach churn. An adult mare, dark brown fur contrasting with the foal's, was caught in a tangle of barbed wire. It wasn't old fencing. The wires were new, recently installed. Someone had fenced off that area without authorization. Probably trespassers trying to stake out territory on his land. The mare must have tried to graze and gotten entangled during the night. The injuries were serious. The wire cut deep into her hind legs and neck. The more she struggled to free herself, the more she hurt herself. As it was, she would die right there if she didn't bleed to death first. Edward looked at the foal, which was now beside its mother, sniffing her wounds and whinnying softly. He understood everything. The animal wasn't lost. It was seeking help. His first thought was to call animal control or the ranch's veterinary team, someone prepared to deal with injured wild horses. He had no equipment, no experience, and he would be late for the video conference. But as he dialed the number, he heard a sound that chilled his blood, a low growl coming from the nearby trees. Mountain lion. There had been tracks of cougars in that region, and injured mares were easy prey. Edward looked at the mare again. She had stopped fighting the wires and was lying on her side, breathing heavily, eyes half closed. There wasn't much time. If he waited for the team to arrive, it would be too late. He went back to the SUV and opened the tool compartment. Pliers, hammer, work gloves. It wasn't ideal, but it would have to do. For the first time in 2 decades, Edward Miller was going to get his hands dirty for something that wouldn't bring him a cent of profit. He approached the mare slowly, speaking softly to calm her, while the foal watched every move. He started by cutting the less tensioned wires first, being careful not to scare the animal further. When the third wire was cut, and the mare managed to move one of her hind legs, Edward felt something strange in his chest. Something he hadn't felt in a long time. It was almost like hope. It took almost an hour to completely free the mare. Edward cut each wire with surgical precision, his $1,000 dress shirt now torn and blood-stained. The work gloves didn't prevent the barbs from cutting his hands, but he continued, more determined than he had felt in years. When the last wire was removed, the mare tried to stand up, but her hind legs trembled and she almost fell. The injuries were deeper than Edward had imagined. She would need urgent veterinary care. As he carried basic medical supplies from the SUV, Edward noticed something that made him stop abruptly. A faded wooden sign, half hidden by vegetation, with letters he could barely make out. Serenity Valley, private property, 1998. Serenity Valley. The name hit Edward like a punch to the gut. He knew that sign. He had helped his father install it when he was 17. Shortly before leaving for college, shortly before everything fell apart. With trembling hands, Edward wiped the sign with his shirt sleeve. Beneath decades of dirt, more words appeared. In memory of the free Mustangs. May they run forever. Robert Miller, 1998. Robert Miller, his father, dead 12 years ago in a car accident, returning from a trip Edward had refused to join. Their last conversation had been a bitter argument about wrong priorities and lost values. Edward was too busy building his empire to pay attention to his father's romantic philosophies about preservation and simple living. The memory came like an avalanche. Robert feeding wild horses in this very valley, explaining the importance of maintaining natural corridors, dreaming of transforming the property into a sanctuary. Edward had called it all unproductive sentimentality and left for the city, promising he would only return when his father stopped playing animal protector and started thinking like a businessman. He never returned. 6 months after his father's death, Edward had inherited all the land. His first decision was to cancel all conservation projects, focusing exclusively on commercial ranching. Serenity Valley was abandoned, forgotten, left for nature to reclaim. But the wild horses remained there. The mare now lying at his feet was part of the same herd his father had fed every day for years. The albino foal that had guided him there was probably born in this valley, on the lands Robert dreamed of protecting forever. Edward knelt beside the mare and, for the first time in 12 years, allowed the tears to come. He wasn't crying for the injured mare. He was crying for the father who died waiting for a call that never came. He was crying for the words he never said, the forgiveness he never asked for, the chance for redemption he squandered out of pride. The foal approached and touched Edward's arm with its muzzle, an almost human gesture of comfort. In that moment, he understood. He wasn't there by chance. The foal hadn't chosen him randomly on the road. Something bigger was happening, something his father would have called the circle coming full. He picked up his cell phone to cancel the video conference with the Japanese. For the first time in 2 decades, money wasn't the priority. He had a mare to save and a promise to keep, even if it was too late for the man he should have listened to. The veterinarian arrived 3 hours later in a dusty pickup truck with emergency veterinary equipment. Dr. Peterson, a 50-year-old man with calloused hands and an experienced gaze, examined the mare in silence before looking up at Edward. She'll survive, but she'll need intensive care for at least a month. Antibiotics, daily dressings, absolute rest. For a wild horse, that practically means temporary domestication. He paused, studying Edward's face. You know this will cost a fortune, right? And there's no guarantee she'll accept human care. Edward nodded without hesitation. Do whatever is necessary. As the veterinarian sedated the mare for transport, Edward walked to the faded sign again. With his thumb, he traced the letters of his father's name. Robert Miller had died believing his eldest son was a soulless man, obsessed only with profit, and perhaps he was right. Mr. Miller? The veterinarian approached, removing his gloves. Can I ask a question? Why are you doing this? I mean, it's not like it's your obligation. Edward took a moment to reply. How to explain that he was trying to save much more than an injured mare? That he was trying to save what was left of his humanity? Let's just say I have a debt to repay. In the following weeks, Edward did something he had never done in his career. He cancelled important appointments to oversee the mare's recovery. He built a temporary fenced enclosure near the ranch headquarters, hired specialized wild horse handlers, and visited the animals twice a day. His executive team didn't understand. During a video meeting with European investors, a partner directly questioned his unexplained expenses and lack of focus. Edward coldly replied that his decisions didn't need approval, but inside he felt something cracking. The crack between who he had become and who he could have been. The foal, which had been christened Light by the veterinary team, always stayed close to its mother. Edward found himself spending hours observing them, fascinated by how the young animal cared for the injured mare, bringing water, keeping itself between her and any perceived threat. It was during one of these silent observations that Carmen, the housekeeper, approached with a yellowed envelope. I found this cleaning your father's office. It was inside a locked drawer. She hesitated before handing it over. I think he wanted you to see it. The envelope had his name written in the familiar handwriting. Inside, a letter dated just 6 months before his father's death. Edward, I know you'll probably never read this, but I need to try one last time. Yesterday I fed the Mustangs of Serenity Valley as I have every day for 15 years. There was a pregnant mare in the herd. She should give birth in the next few weeks. As I watched her, I could only think of the boy who used to accompany me there, who was fascinated watching the horses run free. I still feed these horses because I still hope that one day that boy will come back, that you will come back, not to the valley necessarily, but to yourself, your father who never stopped loving you. Edward folded the letter with trembling hands. The mare he was caring for was approximately 12 years old. The timelines matched perfectly. She could very well be the pregnant foal his father had mentioned in the letter. For the first time, he understood that he wasn't just saving two wild horses. He was trying to save himself. The transformation started small, almost imperceptible. Edward arrived at the office later, left earlier. He paused in the middle of meetings to check messages from the veterinarian about the mare's progress. His assistant commented that he seemed different, but couldn't quite define how. The real change came when Edward made a decision that shocked his entire executive team. He cancelled the sale of a ranch to a meatpacking plant that offered $20 million above market value. The property included 10 miles of native woodlands that would be cleared for industrial expansion. That's 10 miles of natural corridor, he explained to furious partners during a tense video conference, where wild animals have migrated for decades. When they questioned the loss, Edward hung up the call. The following week, he did something even more radical. He sought out Mrs. Jenkins, a 73-year-old woman he had evicted 3 years earlier when he bought the land where she had lived for 40 years. He found her living in a small house on the outskirts of town, surviving on a meager pension. "Mrs. Jenkins," Edward said, standing at the door holding an envelope, "I've come to return something I should never have taken." Inside the envelope was the deed to the original land, properly transferred back into her name, free of charge, no conditions. Mrs. Jenkins didn't smile, didn't thank him effusively. She just took the documents and nodded once, as if she knew that moment would eventually come. "My father used to say that the land always reclaims what's hers," was all she said before closing the door. Edward then began a meticulous process of reparation. He found every family he had questionably dispossessed in the last 5 years. He located former employees abruptly fired. He sought out small producers he had pressured into selling their properties for paltry sums. Not everyone accepted his attempts at reparation. Some slammed the door in his face. Others accepted the money, but made it clear that some wounds wouldn't heal with financial compensation. Edward learned that redemption wasn't about being forgiven. It was about doing things differently, regardless of the outcome. The mare, christened Hope, recovered quickly. In 6 weeks, she could walk without difficulty. The veterinarian suggested it was time to reintroduce her to her natural habitat, but Edward hesitated, not out of concern for the animals, out of concern for himself. Caring for the mare and foal had become the only time of day he felt at peace. Observing them, feeding them, simply being present without an agenda or financial goals. It was like rediscovering a version of himself he had buried decades ago. It was during one of these morning visits that he made the final decision. He called his law firm and instructed them to begin the process of creating a permanent reserve. All of Serenity Valley would be transformed into a sanctuary for wild horses, exactly as his father had dreamed. When he told Hope and Light about the plan, speaking softly as he brushed the mare's mane, he felt something he hadn't experienced in decades: genuine pride. Not the empty kind that came with acquisitions and financial achievements, but the pride of finally honoring the memory of someone he loved. "Your grandfather would be proud," he said to Light, who was munching grass nearby. "It took me 12 years, but I finally understood what he was trying to teach me." The foal raised its head and looked at him with those unique pink eyes, as if it understood every word perfectly. 18 months passed since the rescue. Edward, now 59, woke before dawn not to check stock market quotes, but to walk to the valley and observe Hope and Light running free with the significantly grown herd. The Robert Miller Sanctuary was officially recognized by the Fish and Wildlife Service as a permanent preservation area. 17 wild horses lived protected on its 200 acres, including 2 foals born during the last year. Edward had hired 2 expert biologists and a full-time veterinarian to monitor the herd's health. Light, now almost 3 years old, had become a strong and imposing young stallion, a natural leader among the younger ones. Hope, at 13, showed natural signs of aging, but remained active and alert. Edward had learned to accept that in nature, 15 years was considered an advanced age for wild horses. Every day with her was a gift. Edward's life had changed drastically. He sold half of his properties, reduced his company by 60%, and donated $15 million to conservation projects across the country. He was no longer the richest man in the region, but for the first time in decades, he slept peacefully. His sister had started talking to him again. During a lunch at his simple house near the sanctuary, she commented, "Dad always said you'd come home when you were ready. I just didn't imagine it would take so long." Edward smiled, watching Light through the window. Some of us need wild horses to guide us back. One December afternoon, while checking the watering holes, Edward found a forgotten letter in his jacket pocket, the last one his father had left, the one Carmen had found months earlier. He reread it for the 100th time, but this time something different caught his attention. On the bottom margin, in tiny, almost imperceptible handwriting, there was a note he had never noticed. P.S. If anything happens to me, take care of the Mustangs. They always knew the way home better than any of us. In that moment, Edward understood something profound. His father hadn't just fed wild horses for 15 years. He had prepared a way back home for the son who might one day be lost enough to need to be guided by an albino foal to redemption. The following week, he received a call that would change everything again. A young, arrogant, and ruthless businessman wanted to buy land adjacent to the sanctuary to install a pesticide factory. It was Edward, 10 years younger, ambitious, unscrupulous, seeing only numbers where there was life. Edward smiled as he hung up the phone. He knew exactly what to do. He wouldn't try to convince the man with words. Words had never worked on himself. Instead, he invited him for a visit to the properties. "I want to show you something that might interest you," he said. As he prepared for the visit, Edward stroked Hope's neck. "You and Light saved a lost man," he murmured. "Now perhaps it's our turn to save another." The mare whinnied softly, as if agreeing with the plan. The morning was clear when the businessman arrived in his luxury SUV, Armani suit and familiar arrogance. Edward immediately recognized the expression. It was the same one he saw in the mirror years ago. Calculated coldness, masking a deep emptiness the man probably didn't even know existed. "Mr. Sterling, welcome," Edward said simply, indicating a simple SUV. "The area you're interested in is on the other side of the valley." During the drive, Mr. Sterling talked incessantly about profits, expansion, and aggressive growth opportunities. Edward just drove in silence, remembering himself giving exactly the same speeches. When they arrived at Serenity Valley, Edward stopped near the old wooden sign, now restored and shining. "This is the area," he deliberately lied, knowing it wasn't. "But before we talk business, I want to show you something interesting." They walked to an elevation where the entire herd was visible. 17 wild horses grazed freely, including Hope and Light, who now led a group of young stallions. The scene was one of pure, wild beauty, exactly as Robert Miller had dreamed. "Wild mustangs," Edward explained. "They've lived here for generations." Mr. Sterling snorted impatiently. "Wild animals are a problem for the Fish and Wildlife Service to solve. When we set up the factory, they'll just have to go." Edward watched Light approach curiously, those unique pink eyes studying the visitor. The young albino stallion had grown magnificently, no longer the desperate foal that had blocked a road seeking help, but a natural leader, strong and confident. "You know, Mr. Sterling, 2 years ago I thought exactly like you," Edward said calmly. "Wild animals were an inconvenience, negative numbers on spreadsheets." "And why did you change your mind?" Mr. Sterling asked with disdain. "Late sentimentality?" Edward smiled. "No, I changed because an albino foal taught me something that Harvard Business School never taught." He then told the complete story. The rescue, his father's letter, the gradual transformation. He spoke about nights when he couldn't sleep thinking about the people he had harmed, about the discovery that wealth without purpose was just a golden cage, about learning that real legacy wasn't measured in zeros in a bank account. Mr. Sterling listened with growing irritation. When Edward finished, he laughed coldly. "Touching story. But it doesn't change the fact that I'm willing to pay 40 million for this land." "They're not for sale," Edward replied simply. "Everything is for sale at the right price. Not these lands. Never." As Mr. Sterling left furiously, promising to find other ways to acquire the area, Edward remained in the valley. Hope approached as she always did in moments of reflection, allowing him to stroke her neck. "Maybe he's not ready yet," Edward murmured to the mayor. "Maybe he'll need his own albino foal one day." As the sun set over Serenity Valley, Edward walked to his father's sign and added a new inscription, "Continued by Edward Miller. It's never too late to come home." Light whinnied softly in the distance, a sound Edward had learned to interpret as approval. Looking at the stars that began to appear, Edward knew that Robert Miller could finally rest in peace. His son had found his way back. This story is about regret, about words we didn't say, calls we didn't make, people we left behind while chasing things that don't matter. If you have someone you love but are distant from out of pride, out of anger, out of being too busy, don't wait to need a wild horse to teach you what truly matters. Call, write, show up, because unlike Edward, you still have time. And if this story reminded you of someone, or if you believe in second chances, share it. We never know who needs to hear this today. Thank you for watching. See you in the next story.